The ongoing U.S. immigration debate, from the future of DACA and family separation to the status of asylum seekers and international students. Good afternoon and welcome to Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs and this webinar series brought to you by the Dorothea Green Lecture Series, co-sponsored by the College of Law, the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum, and Americans for Immigrant Justice. I'm David Kramer, Senior Fellow in the Green School at FIU here in Miami, and I'll serve as today's moderator. Immigration remains a hot button issue in the United States. The June 18th United States Supreme Court decision blocked, at least temporarily, the Trump administration's attempt to do away with the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And yet the White House continues to push to dismantle the program, which has protected approximately 700,000 undocumented youths from deportation and curb immigration more broadly, including those seeking asylum in this country. Family separation policy continues at the U.S. Mexico border, and the COVID-19 pandemic is making matters even more difficult and challenging. The Trump administration's recent proposal to expel international students from the country if they had no in-person classes in the middle of the pandemic has been receded, or hasn't. We have a terrific panel here to discuss these and other pertinent issues. Juan Carlos Gomez is Associate Clinical Professor, Director of the Carlos A. Costa Immigration Human Rights Clinic at FIU. Adonia Simpson is Director of the Family Defense Program with Americans for Immigrant Justice. Jack McGuire is a PhD student in sociology in the Global and Sociocultural Studies Department. And we're also joined today by Amy Galpin with the Frost Art Museum as FIU Chief Curator. And Amy's going to start us off by telling us about a very relevant exhibit at the museum. So Amy, let me turn to you first.
Thank you, David. It's a privilege to be here today and to join you. I'm going to share just a few slides that will give you a sneak peek of an upcoming exhibition at the Frost Art Museum called Otros Lados. This show is inspired by the first year reading text for incoming freshmen at FIU. It's a memoir by Reina Grande called A Dream Called Home. Here you see a work by Judith Hernandez. Hernandez is a leader of the Chicano art movement in Los Angeles. You're looking at her work, Chupacabra Gothic. It's certainly a take on a very well-known painting by Grant Wood called American Gothic, or Frida Kahlo's The Two Fridas. You see a goat having its blood sucked, literally, by a figure that is cloaked with the U.S. flag. Judith Hernandez, if you can go to the next slide, is an accomplished artist with work in, most recently, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York's permanent collection. On the left, you see her work, Murderous Secrets. This is a body of work that Judith Hernandez made about the violence against women that has taken place in Ciudad Juarez. Otros Lados includes not only Judith's work, but two other artists, one being Hugo Crossway, whose work is represented in the middle of the screen with his piece Tijuana, Mi Amor, and Itzel Basualdo. Itzel is a graduate of FIU, a young artist who's made a body of work called Mexico, Just a Calling Card Away. It's a body of work that's about her return to Mexico and visiting with her mother's relatives. Hugo's work is about his life crisscrossing the Mexico-US border. Born in Rosarito, he was raised in a curio shop just south of Tijuana, but his first museum visit was to the San Diego Museum of Art, where he became inspired by a painting from the workshop of Hieronymus Bosch. Hugo's work portrays a brutal beauty of Tijuana and also of San Diego. Next slide. At the Frost Art Museum, I'm very committed to telling Mexican and Mexican-American narratives. For me, Mexican culture is a culture without borders, and the way in which Mexican culture and identity continues to impact artists in the US cannot be denied. Not only with the show Otros Lados will you be able to see Mexican and Mexican-American experiences, but also in our other fall show, House to House, Women, Politics, and Place. On the left is a work by Ramiro Gomez. Just yesterday, his work was featured in an article in the LA Times about labor, immigrant labor, and generations who've settled in Los Angeles. In this work on the left, abstract painting, Ramiro Gomez took an ad from a magazine and placed the labor in this aesthetically beautiful scene. If you look closely, you'll see a woman cleaning this interior. Ramiro's own story is that his parents came to the US from Mexico, working and cleaning, and his father as a truck driver. Ramiro then got a job as a nanny in the Hollywood Hills, and he's committed in his work to making labor that's too often invisible, visible in our country. The last slide, please. You may be familiar with this image in thinking about attending the panel today. This is also a work by Judith Hernandez, in which she relates a lot of cultural symbols from loteria cards on the work on the right to the monarch butterfly on the left. The central figure relates many pre-Columbian symbols. At the bottom, you see a reference to Coatlicue, the Mexica goddess, she of the serpent skirt. The title of this piece, Dreams Between the Earth and Sky, relate a liminal space, a space in between, in which the artist in Otros Lados and so many people live between multiple cultures. I hope you'll join us both virtually and hopefully in person at the Frost Art Museum this fall. Thank you so much for the time to share a little bit about these exhibitions.
Amy, thank you very much. It's, I think, really important for our viewers to get an understanding of the depth and different perspectives we offer here at FIU. So thanks very much for sharing that with us. Juan, let's jump into the conversation with you if we can. Give us the latest state of affairs when it comes to the issue of immigration and where we are.
Thank you for inviting me. And the issues that we are facing are that in a way, for about 3.5 years now, we've been facing a certain amount of chaos in the world of immigration. Not that there wasn't a certain amount of chaos before, but now one of the things that's happened is that the president is not only building a physical wall and doing everything he can to skirt around the law and testing law as much as they can, and this has been their strategy since day one. But now one of the things that happens is that you have this virtual wall that has been growing and growing and growing, so that today a combination of the pandemic has caused consulates and certain amount of other chaos involved in consulates closing or limiting their operations across the world. You have CIS offices on the verge of opening, and some opened in limited ways, some opened in almost no way. I mean, in the sense of that it's impossible to have a healthy operation. And then the problem is also that CIS is threatened by this concept of a furlough, which is, many people say, sort of a political theater, a bit of political theater, because there really is, the funding is there. The question is CIS trying to sort of shift money from CIS money or money fees that have been collected to CBP, to Customs and Border Protection, or to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And then you have a bunch of other issues, including proposed asylum regs. You have a split in how the law should be enforced on public charge. You have the issue with student visas and the fights that have taken place in courts. You have the very idea of whether student visas can be processed. You have the issue of being able to bring family members or not. And then you have potential, well, not potential, but proposed regulations related to employment authorization and just enforcement that is completely inhumane and irrational, very driven by ideology, in that despite concerns for health, ICE has continued picking up and transferring individuals without even having the appropriate tools to test and to keep ICE employees, ICE contractors, detainees, and lawyers, and Department of Justice employees safe, but they have to keep the machine going. So in that long list of, and there's more that I could throw in, you have then the DACA situation, which Adonia, I think, was in the best position to comment on.
Great one. Thanks very much, Adonia. Let's turn to you on the DACA issue, which is, of course, of enormous interest to many at FIU and the broader community here in South Florida.
Thanks so much, David. And I think Juan gave just a little bit of all the issues that we've been dealing with in the last few years. And as advocates, I think our heads are constantly spinning, trying to adjust to whatever the new development is of the day. So when we talk about DACA, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, I think we need to give a little bit of context in how we ended up to DACA and then where we stand today. So various versions of DREAM Act legislation have been introduced since 2001. I think there was nearly 18 versions introduced since 2001, and Congress has never been able to pass any sort of comprehensive way to address dreamers or young people that came here when they're children, who've studied here, who've put down roots here, who are part of our communities. So in response to that, what we saw happen in 2012 was President Obama took a long-standing policy called Deferred Action. And just a little interesting tidbit that you might be interested in is that actually one of the most prominent and well-known recipients of Deferred Action was actually John Lennon in the 70s. So you can tell that Deferred Action has been something that's been granted on an individual basis for many, many years. And the action that would be deferred is removal or any sort of enforcement action. What happened with the 2012 memo under Obama is they took this concept of deferred action and applied it to a wider group of individuals. If young people met certain requirements, if they arrived before a certain date, if they studied here, if they were a certain age before arrival, they had no certain criminal history or background, they would be eligible for this concept of deferred action, which means that they would be able and entitled to get work authorization. So this really, in the absence of Congress being able to pass any legislation, this was an amazing thing for so many young people. It allowed them to get driver's licenses, go to college, get jobs. It really changed the game for a lot of people. So let's fast forward. Shortly after the election, there was a lot of talk that one of the things that would first be done was a rescission of this executive order. What happened in 2012 with President Obama was an executive order. And there's been a long-standing view that the executive has a lot of authority when it comes to implementing and executing and enforcing immigration laws. So just as easily as Obama was able to create this new policy and create this deferred action for childhood arrivals, subsequent administrations could essentially undo it. And that's what we saw. We saw a rescission in, I believe it was 2017. It seems so long ago. And then subsequent litigation across the country. We did have an injunction, which that means that it prohibited the rescission from fully going into effect, that allowed people to continue to renew their DACA and renew their work authorization. And David, as you mentioned, on the 18th of June, frankly, I was surprised by the decision. I think a lot of us as immigrant advocates weren't anticipating the decision from the Supreme Court, and were thrilled. But let's actually talk about what that decision was. The decision actually states that the administration can terminate the program, that they can rescind the program, but they just have to go through certain steps to do it, to really provide an analysis about the impact on DACA recipients, and go through certain steps under the Administrative Procedures Act. So even though the decision was great because it didn't allow the administration to rescind the program as they had previously tried to do, it did give a roadmap on how to do it in the future. And so that's what we're anticipating. A formal rescission has not happened, but what did happen last week was a memo from immigration limiting the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And it does a few things that are really concerning. First of all, the Supreme Court decision really reinstated the initial 2012 DACA program, which means certain things should have been allowed by the agency. It means that people that become eligible, and there's thousands of people that become eligible for DACA every single day, that these initial applications should be accepted. It also said that individuals should be able to travel with permission for under certain circumstances under advanced parole, and a continuation for individuals to be able to renew their DACA status. So that's what the decision should have implemented. What we saw was USCIS, which is U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, the agency that's in charge of accepting and processing these applications, actually never issued any guidance, which was really concerning. So we saw a lot of people across the country filing initial DACA applications. We've now seen those applications rejected. And the memo that came out last week did a few things. It said clearly that they will not accept and they will reject applications for initial or first-time DACA filings, that they now will only accept advanced parole applications in exceptional circumstances, which is kind of unclear what that may mean or who may qualify. And then finally, I think, which is most concerning, and Juan and I spoke about this earlier, was now they are limiting the work authorization and the DACA categorization from 2 years to 1 year. And that applies to individuals who actually may have pending renewal applications at USCIS, at immigration. So we have a lot of people that, because of the pandemic, there was issues with fingerprints and rescheduling of fingerprints, or they didn't reuse fingerprints. So we have a lot of individuals who maybe applied a few months ago under the expectation that they would get work authorization for 2 years, and now will be granted work authorization for 1 year. So that's where we're at.
No, thank you. I know there's a lot going on that issue, Danya. So thank you. We'll come back on these. Jack, let me turn to you for some of the comments on what's going on.
Well, yeah, I mean, Juan and Adonia definitely, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the whole situation is horrible. But one thing that's also really hurting people is that not only are they shortening these timeframes, but the USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, is taking a lot longer to process all of this paperwork. So, for instance, before the Trump administration came to office, it took about 2 months on average to get a work permit. Now it's taking somewhere to where like 6 or 8 months. And so if you're waiting for this period of time, it's not only very stressful, but you're also running out that clock of when you have this valid work authorization. And so, for instance, if you're an asylum seeker and you're waiting for this work permit, you oftentimes don't have a lot of money. Like, there are not a lot of asylum seekers with any money. And so you're forced in this impossible situation where you're supposed to be waiting for this work authorization, but then you don't have the ability to work, but you need to work in order to live. And quite recently, the Trump administration issued a new rule. I'm not 100% sure if it's finalized yet, that you used to have to wait for 150 days before you could even apply for a work permit. Now that's extended up to 1 year. And so the problem is, if you're caught working without work authorization, that really damages your case and is grounds for deportation. And so this is just another example of how the Trump administration is really trying to, if you're not undocumented now, they're trying to push you into this realm where you are deportable and or undocumented if you're caught doing all these things. And so that is a consistent pattern with just about everything. That includes permanent residence, all this sort of stuff. And so, it's all just not very good.
Jack, thank you. Let me just remind our viewers, I think this is, I'm sure, not your first time tuning into a Zoom chat. There's the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can send questions to the panel, and we will do our best to address those questions that come in. One, let me come back to you and ask about another element of this, and that is asylum policy. If you could touch on that. The administration seems to have taken a much more restrictive approach on allowing asylees into the United States, and that can have a big impact on cases that go before judges. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Well, the ones coming into the country are refugees, and that quota has become almost insignificant. It's insignificant, but then of course right now you have basically no processing. The second part of that is, though, that the proposed asylum regulations will create such a chilling effect that if a judge finds, not that the standard used to be or currently is, that if you make a material misrepresentation, you could be barred for life. The new standard is if a judge believes that there is no basis for your asylum, in other words, they believe that you should not be granted because they don't believe that there's a basis for it because you don't meet one of the many technicalities that have been invented over the years on asylum, the issue is that you could be barred for life also. And they are also, one of my favorite horrifying things is that we have something called the Immigration and Nationality Act that has a mechanism in it that allows a person to go through proceedings before an immigration judge to defend themselves. And the proposed process is an alternative to regular removal proceedings, so that basically is sort of, they don't want to call it expedited, but they basically want to churn, and several lawyers, and this isn't original to me, have called it the weaponizing of the immigration court. And one of the things that happens is that, for example, the Attorney General has certified more decisions to himself than any other Attorney General. This is Mr. Sessions and then Mr. Barr. And one of the things that happens is that basically the Attorney General is coming up with rules to limit. So you have regulations, and then you have in administrative process something called adjudication. And one of the things that's happened is that they are coming up with every possible way to make receiving asylum almost impossible. The numbers show already that people are, that there's a significant decline in approval ratings before the pandemic. The other big issue is access to counsel, because they have made it so that, I'll give you the best example of a case represented by some of by the clinic, a gentleman who is not all there. He has mental health issues, and ICE simply decided to move him to New Mexico. That's because organizations like Americans for Immigrant Justice and other wonderful heroes were fighting the issue of ICE continuing to hold individuals without any protection regarding COVID-19. So what ICE started doing is, rather than releasing individuals, ICE would simply move them away. Well, nobody notified us. No, I mean, we had to, once we discovered, we had to run to court. And the question is, how often, you have to think of the resources of the US government, and then think of the resources of individuals, especially people seeking asylum. And the problem is that people say, oh, it's okay, you can run to court and get an order. And the answer is, well, how many things can you do in one day? How many things can you continue to fight? How many battlefronts can you have? And so in asylum, you have the asylum issue, you have the adjudication, you have access to counsel. One of my favorites is that basically the biggest problem you have is an interpreting, and you've seen courts across the country where they basically have made it much more difficult for, let's just say they restructured the process in terms of how some interpreters operate. In Miami, there was a pilot program where people were doing telephonic interpreting. And the thing is, though, that it's almost impossible to do a fair hearing with a telephonic interpreter, especially when people really have no idea. You can't see the person, you can't really exchange with a person. And so you put all that together, and it goes back to my theme of the virtual wall.
Great, Juan, thank you very much. Danya, let me come back to the DACA. And if you would, give us a sense of the magnitude of what we're talking about, both on a national level, if you could, but also on a regional level. And if you have a sense of the degree to which the number of people affected here in South Florida are involved.
Yeah, that's a great question. As you mentioned, numbers are a little bit in flux. You mentioned earlier the 700,000. I think that's the most accurate number of individuals nationwide. It's really important to note two things from that number. One, there's a lot of young people, a lot of these people that actually become eligible for an alternative route to residency. As you know, DACA does not provide a direct pathway to get your green card. But on occasion, given some circumstances and some facts, some clients actually are able to pursue a separate, more permanent pathway. So sometimes we see that number go down a little bit as we see clients beginning to pursue another avenue besides DACA. But then that number actually increases because, as I alluded to earlier, every day thousands of young people become eligible for DACA. And the reason that is there's a lower age limit. And you're not able to apply with certain exceptions until you hit that age. I believe it's 15, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I did an initial DACA application.
Yes, it is 15. Yes, I remember.
So every day we have young people that are now suddenly meeting those requirements and meet all the requirements for DACA that should be able to apply for the first time, and now we're not going to be able to. In Florida, I believe the last time I checked numbers, it's several tens of thousands of DACA recipients in Florida alone. And it's important to note that many of these people are doing essential work, whether it's in the healthcare industry, whether it's in the food delivery pipeline or in hospitality. I mean, there's a lot of very essential work happening with DACA recipients. So that's a really big concern for us. So I hope that answered the question in regards to the numbers.
Absolutely. No, thanks very much for that. Appreciate it. Jack, if you would, I know you've followed the issue about the separations and the conditions that broken up families find themselves. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what you've learned in looking into this?
Yeah, so family separation still continues despite the court ruling that said you couldn't. The administration continues to violate what's called the Flores settlement, which says that you can't hold children in custody more than 20 days. And they continue to, some new things that are happening is that it's apparently there have been some news reports out recently that they're not even going through these official processes to deport children when they come into the United States. So typically a child or a minor that comes to the United States requesting asylum, or is with a family which requesting asylum is supposed to meet with a social worker and an attorney, and there's these different rules and regulations. And what the Trump administration is apparently doing is that they're just avoiding all of that, and they're using these private contractors to hold children in places like hotels, where they do not have access to attorneys or social workers. And then in cases they're deporting these children without the knowledge of their families or their parents back to their countries of origin. And that obviously creates huge problems, but then there's also these other methods of family separation that are going on. So in the Remain in Mexico policy, one way that they're trying to split apart families is that there are these cases where families will get court dates because there's families are applying for asylum, they all have the same court date. And so, for instance, if you're in Nogales, Mexico, which is kind of over towards Texas, they'll give some members of the family a court date in Nogales, Mexico, and then they'll give other family members a court date in San Diego. And so they're somehow supposed to, once again, we have to remember that these aren't people with a lot of resources, if any resources. They're somehow supposed to all get to the same court date on the same day from Nogales all the way over to, San Diego, and somehow coordinate all of that. And the other option they're giving parents that are in detention that are waiting for their asylum cases or other cases, they're given this option where it's, okay, we will let your children leave, but you have to remain in detention. And, we will, but the way they do this is also there's these cases that have come out in news reports again, where they'll basically threaten it's like you can either see your child again, or you can all be deported together, or you can never see your child again. That's how Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, that's how Customs and Border Patrol are framing these options for these parents to try and get them to sign things that they don't understand, and that have really just these serious consequences that they don't know. And this is just another way. The crazy part is this is all intentional. I think this is something we all have to remember. This is part of a larger strategy called prevention through deterrence, which has been in place since the 90s, which basically is that we are going to try and inflict so much pain and suffering on you that other people decide that they don't want to come, and that you decide that you don't want to try and come back. And that has been expanded within the interior of the United States in certain states and localities that have adopted these policies called attrition through enforcement, which is basically the same thing, where it's like, okay, we're going to deny you access to social services, we're going to deny you access to education, we're going to deny you access to housing, and then we're going to increase the amount of immigration enforcement, all just these repression tactics. And the goal is that it just gets so horrible that people decide to self-deport. And one of the most infamous cases of this is in Arizona, where in Maricopa County, which is, I think if you all remember, Sheriff Joe Arpaio was one of the things they did. They deputized these civilian police forces to go out and conduct immigration enforcement. And it is just this sort of this method of just trying to ramp up this fear and this sense of just this sense of panic of not being able to do anything. And it's, instead of driving people out, what happens is it makes people more exploitable. So one of the things that undocumented immigrants are included for their labor, specifically so they can be exploited. So employers will work with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement to deport people, for instance, right before they get their paychecks, or if they start to complain or protest, the employer will notify Immigrations and Customs Enforcement and come and deport them. And so it's just this whole series of actions similar to that.
Great, Jack. Thanks a lot for that. Juan, let's bring in another issue that came up recently.
If I could, David, before that.
Yeah, go ahead, sure.
Two interesting points based on what Adonia and Jack were commenting. One of the interesting things, if people think that this doesn't hit home, in the Cuban community, a very interesting thing has happened because you have this continuous discussion of human rights in Cuba, but then the way that Cubans have been treated in the last 3.5 years is it's extraordinarily shameful, as is shameful the way others are treated. But one of the most interesting things is that you'll find people being sent to, you'll have the wife sent to one state, one detention facility, the husband sent to another. And my favorite is when someone is sent to there are judges in Louisiana, one particular one who basically does not grant asylum. And now imagine if you, instead of releasing someone and allowing them to fight for their asylum claim, that this person is in detention. And right now you have one of the oddest cases is one where the mother and child were granted asylum in one state. The husband was removed back to Mexico, and they are waiting for the mother to be able to petition, the wife, that is, to petition for her husband instead of treating the whole family together. And one of the interesting things is that there is complete and utter silence from the Cuban American community on this issue. It is just shameful how people are allowing this to happen, not just with the Cuban community, but with other communities also, because people don't understand that this will eventually impact them, because it's easy to target vulnerable populations like aliens who do not have resources. But I assure you that once law enforcement is done, and think of the industry, think of the private prison industry, think of how local sheriffs are making money from the federal government by housing, by filling beds. And so instead of releasing someone, they continue to fill these beds. But the question is, since ICE has basically unfettered power, you have this insanity happening. The other example that related to what Adonia mentioned was, if you remember, there was an interview shortly after the Supreme Court issued a decision on DACA, and the president was speaking to Jose Diaz-Balart, and he said that he was going to resolve the DACA situation, that he was going to, as an executive, give a solution or give status to these individuals, which, by the way, is the exact argument that all the anti-immigration forces have been arguing, that the executive doesn't have the power. Their argument, by the way, is completely interesting, because if the law applies to one person, it applies to not just 700,000, it applies to as many people who will qualify. But the argument is, oh, no, 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 you can't apply deferred action to too many people. So shortly after the president made his announcement, then all of a sudden, all the staffers started walking it back. And so that there is this theater of, oh, yes, 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 we're going to resolve this. But then the truth is that the anti-immigration forces in control of government currently are not going to allow anything reasonable to happen. As a matter of fact, their agenda is to make it even worse because they know that they can, and that they know that, as a matter of fact, in the DACA situation, one of the interesting sort of trump cards, pun intended in a way, is that the case that was originally brought during the Obama administration in southern Texas is basically held in abeyance, so that if the Trump administration were to no longer be in power, then the attorney generals who brought the action in southern Texas would reactivate that case to then attack DACA. So then the answer is, it's very good strategy if you're looking at it from their perspective. But my goodness, stop saying that they're going to come up with reform, because the truth is that there was a chance with Senators McCain and Kennedy in 2007. There was a chance in 2013, and every single anti-immigration person, including Mr. Sessions, no longer senator or attorney general, were the people who blocked it. And so now his little disciple, Mr. Miller, is out there making sure that he and others make sure that the anti-immigration agenda is fulfilled. So keep this in mind when you hear about, oh yes, we're going to come up with solutions. You really need to think about, when you're presenting your case, whether it's a wise thing to do it in the next few months, and we need to see what happens, because it's really going to get even worse than what we've seen based on what we've seen.
Juan, thank you. Donia and the whole panel, I want to bring up two more issues in our remaining time. Donia, on the whole COVID relief efforts, how has immigration factored into any attempts by Congress and the administration to address these problems?
David, that's a great question. The pandemic has really added an extra layer of difficulty when it comes to immigration. What we saw happen with the CARES Act that came out a few months ago is that there was stimulus payments for folks that had a social security number and had been paying taxes, which left out a lot of individuals, but more critically and of note, it left out mixed status families. So what that means is if you were undocumented but paying taxes with an ITIN, a tax identification number, and perhaps you're married to somebody that's a citizen or a green card holder and have children that are citizens, the whole family was excluded from receiving any stimulus money. So that was a really big hole that was left with the CARES Act. There was also no expansion of medical benefits to cover undocumented or immigrants. There was funding provided to medical centers and hospitals and community health centers to cover the uninsured, but we've seen a lot of issues in the community with people that have been unable to pay for, have been charged and been unable to pay for testing. Another issue that we saw that Juan alluded to earlier was the public charge rule that went into effect in February. And there's so much misinformation around the rule, and essentially many immigrants are afraid to get benefits for themselves or their families, even when they're entitled to them, and even when those benefits won't impact their ability to get a green card. So that's been some of the issues, but what's of note is with the current bills that we're looking at, the HEROES Act that passed the House had a lot of provisions. It fixed the hole that was left with the stimulus payments. And it actually provides a 2-year work authorization extension for DACA and TPS recipients, which was really important because that would be an act of Congress. It would be law. So those are two things out of the HEROES Act. But where we're at now is the debate, everything that's come from the Senate for any sort of COVID-related relief really doesn't address any of the concerns of the immigrant community, which you know, we're really trying to push for them to consider these things like the stimulus payments to mixed status households and increasing access for medical care and coverage for people facing that have tested positive for COVID or are hospitalized.
Great, thanks very much for that. Jack, can I turn to you for the other issue I wanted to broach, if you're able to comment on this, and this is the administration's efforts to expel foreign students if their semester was only going to be online, and that after a lot of blowback and suit filed by initially Harvard and MIT against that, and then other universities joined in, the administration seems to have backed off. But do you have a sense of where that stands? Is it off the table now, or is it still a threat that foreign students at FIU and elsewhere should be concerned about?
Yeah, well, Juan and Adonia might be able to describe more of the specifics regarding this, but to the best of my knowledge, so they moved that off the table, but then they imposed this new thing where it's, okay, we're not going to admit new students into the United States if their classes are just going to be online. And so one thing that it is important to remember about the United States immigration system is that it has historically been this mechanism of racial population control. You can start back with the first people to be historically excluded from the United States were Chinese immigrants in the 1880s. And then it went to European immigrants after that. And then now it's been Mexicans and other people from Latin America, basically from the 1920s or 30s all the way up to today. And so a lot of these F1 students are non-white. They are from places mainly like Asia and India and Africa. And so there's no pathway to adjust to permanent. I guess, and once again, Juan and Adonia might be able to comment on this a bit more, but there's no easy pathway to just adjust your status after you get after you graduate from college in the United States. You have to try and get in with an employer who can then sponsor you for permanent residency. But it is just it just follows this pattern of trying to exclude as many non-white people as possible from entering into the United States and possibly having this pathway to enter to get into permanent residency. And so and with the COVID-19 pandemic, as Juan mentioned earlier, a lot of these consulates are just shut down anyway. And so for students who need to have this paperwork processed, who need these visas in order even to be able to come and continue their education if they've left the United States or their visas expired. And these students are also paying thousands of dollars just to be in the United States. They have to pay typically the higher or highest tuition rates to get into these schools. They're left with they're just dropped with not a whole lot if these rules go into effect. And I was going to say one other thing. And then this is kind of where another thing comes in with the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. When they're processing paperwork, they have this huge budget shortfall where they're looking at furloughing, I think, over 50% of their staff. If that happens, then all this paperwork processing just slows down again. And if you're someone who needs to renew your visa on a regular basis, like a student, it creates these extra hurdles that makes it possible that you won't be able, that won't happen. And so you won't be able to come to the United States. You won't be able to either start your education or you won't be able to continue your education.
Juan, did you want to add anything on this?
Sure, yes. There are two important things that students need to keep in mind. One is always make sure that your I-20 is very, it's correct. Make sure that you're in compliance. And even though right now there was a settlement in the Harvard-MIT lawsuit, and that this semester everything seems to be fine, one of the things that happens is that this has created a massive chilling effect in terms of people who you have the pandemic issue, but then you also have the issue of does it make sense to apply to a university in the United States? And so this has affected universities across the United States in a significant way because international students tend to subsidize students. And so one of the problems that you have is that you have universities losing yet another source of revenue in the sense of if there's a university in the Midwest that has actually gotten a policy from Lloyd's if a certain number of students, foreign students, did not come. And I'm not sure if they've actually been able to collect on their policy yet, but given the strange sort of pandemic situation, but you have that side. So one, make sure that you're in compliance with the I-20. Make sure that you are attending a solid program. There are a lot of international students who would attend language programs with all due respect, certain fly-by-night type programs. And the issue is you need to be careful. You need to work with a university, with a college, with whatever institution that has a person who is really reliable connection to ICE, to the SEVIS program, because you want to make sure that you're in compliance, especially when you're talking about the occupational practical training, which has created all sorts of problems, because the transition usually was you went from an F to your occupational practical training, the OPT, to then an H. And with few exceptions, you have a major paralysis of, you already have the low quota numbers, but then there was the president's executive order related to certain commercial visas. And so, especially with executives and H's, the executive one just absolutely made in other words, a transferred executive from a multinational that was transferred from whatever country to the US, how this would protect American jobs was beyond rational. But the thing is, though, that the shrinking, the tightening of this process has created a major problem for universities, for schools across the country, and for the students, because then students are afraid. Remember back in 2017 when we had the first Muslim ban, and then and the issue was that there was Muslim ban 1, Muslim ban 1 point something, but eventually it passed muster in the courts. And the issue is that you have this, and you can anticipate the same situation in the near future, because if the effort is, okay, we're going to make life very difficult for you in the springtime, if we're going to make it difficult for you in next year, if we're not going to give you an opportunity to pursue a career in the United States, then you're going to have a major problem. And you do have more enforcement, bless you, Adonia, you have more enforcement in terms of ICE sort of being on top of students. And so its attendance is essential. Make sure that you keep track of your attendance at schools, because keep a record that you attended, because if there is a mistake and you are mistakenly reported for non-attending because your Wi-Fi or whatever is not working, you need to make sure to show that you are in compliance, because it will impact your future, because a person who violates their F1, which is their student visa, then is inadmissible for a period of 5 years from the United States. And so you need to keep this in mind as you go forward, and universities across the country really need to think about how this is impacting their, not just their revenue, but what that means for their ability to continue and to provide solid education for all of its students. Because if it impacts foreign students, I assure you that it'll impact other students also.
Great, Juan, thank you very much. And I know Rigo answered this question, but since others may wonder too, one of our viewers asked about where they can find a recording of this, and it will be posted after the event is over on the Green Schools Facebook page and its YouTube page as well. So this will be available after the session is over. So thanks for asking, and thanks Rigo for addressing that. Let me, we only have a few minutes left, so I want to ask each of you, Adonia, I'll start with you. It's 2021, whether it's Biden coming in or a second Trump administration, what one or two things briefly would you like to see in 2021 on these issues?
Oh gosh, that's actually a really difficult question, because there's been so much unraveling of our immigration system in the last few years. We've heard about just a few of the things today, whether it's the the asylum, whether it's DACA, public charge, what's happening at the border. I think the number one priority for me would be to create an independent court system. Many people may not realize that the immigration courts are part of the Executive Office of Immigration Review, and it's within the Department of Justice. It's within a prosecution agency, which it's not an independent court. And I think one good step into getting more equitable decisions, to getting better case law in regards to some of these issues, particularly for asylum, would be to create an independent immigration court system and create some sort of safeguards with access to counsel and things like that. So there's a million things that I would like to see happen next year. But I think probably the biggest and the number one thing I would hope for, that it's a huge lift, and I don't know how possible it is, but would be to create an independent court system.
Thanks very much, Adonia. Jack, over to you. Your one or two wish list things.
I definitely agree with Adonia there on the creation of an independent court system that also provides attorneys to immigrants that are seeking asylum and doing other things, because currently they have to find their own attorney. Many people can't afford it, and there's like something like a 5 or 10 times better odds of you winning your court case if you have an attorney. For me, I would definitely say the ending of the Remain in Mexico policy, and the allowing of asylum seekers to come into the United States to allow their cases to play out instead of trapping them on the other side of the border.
Thanks. Juan.
I would suggest, actually, well, it's interesting because I'm afraid of independent courts in terms of immigration, because one of the things that happened is that the courts have been significantly stacked by people who have met sort of a certain filter. The Board of Immigration Appeals, the people who were both appointed by Republican and prior Republican and Democratic administrations were offered a retirement package. And then after they were offered the retirement package and didn't take it, they were then removed and reassigned to do other work. And individuals who have horrifying histories as immigration judges have been appointed to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And so now you have basically, the truth is that you're not likely, it was already hard to win before the Board of Immigration Appeals. And the question is, well, if you have courts stacked across the country and you have the Board of Immigration Appeals, what good will that do? Now, that said, I think that I think that every bit of the 400 or plus, it depends on how you count it, actions that have been taken by this administration that are anti-immigrant have to be, and they're all executive. For someone who complained about executive action too much prior to 2016 and before, this has been quite an imperial administration or executive. And I think that, one, we have to undo that. And then we really do need to disband this detention-motivated, profit-motivated, budget-motivated detention system, because people, my best example of absurdity is that some of these facilities are in places like Lumpkin, Georgia. The probability of you winning in Lumpkin, Georgia, you might as well buy yourself a lotto ticket, because it's kind of, it's in the same range. And having access to counsel is just a joke. And the question is, that facility is now, it's called CoreCivic, but it's Corrections Corporation of America. The CCA is now CoreCivic. And one of the interesting things is that they run this former state prison. And the question is, we really need to stop incentivizing the detention of human beings. We need to stop, these people are treated as prisoners. If you are in a county jail, it doesn't matter if you're an immigration detainee or a prisoner, you are, and so we have to undo that. And it's not just from this administration, from prior administrations, and it really needs to stop, because we are endangering our system by continuing to expand how people can be detained and incentivizing local communities who don't have a job source to, okay, let's bring in another detention facility. Let's create jobs. And so if we can undo that, that would be quite a dream.
Thank you. Adonia, I know you wanted to just say a word about what services are available out there for people in need.
Yeah, I think it's really, as everybody can tell, things are rapidly changing. There's a lot of, things are confusing. So if you or anybody that you know do need legal services, do have questions, make sure you're reaching out to reputable immigration legal services providers or immigration attorneys. Right now, unfortunately, there's a lot of fraud. There's a lot of individuals that are looking to take advantage of immigrants. So please reach out to organizations like Americans for Immigrant Justice, Catholic Legal Services. There's a few organizations out there, or a reputable attorney through the American Immigration Lawyers Association.
Great, thanks. And let's wrap up where we started. Amy, one more plug for the museum's exhibit.
Yeah, thank you so much for this informative panel. I keep coming back to Juan's reference to these inhumane acts. And I think my hope for our exhibition, Otros Lados and House to House, Women, Politics, and Place, is that they are telling a very human story of the issues and legislation that were discussed today. I hope you'll visit cross.fiu.edu. I want to mention that on August 29th, we are having a workshop with an artist, Aurora Molina, and her work benefits Americans for Immigrant Justice. So you can find out about how you can support that artist and Adonia's organization. So thank you.
Amy, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. Adonia Simpson, Jack McGuire, Juan Gomez, thanks to all three of you for joining us here today on this really important conversation. This has been a webinar brought to you by Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs in Miami through the Dorothea Green Lecture Series. My thanks to all of you for joining us and viewing today's session. We'll be back next week with more and have a good and healthy rest of the day. Right after I almost knocked everything out.